Today we return to the Astartes overview series. It's part 3, The Traitors. Now, as with most of anything I do, this series is a little long running. I think part 1 released, I was going to say a year ago, but it's 2 years ago, which is hilarious. So this series is an overview more than a deep dive. It's getting a feel for a Legion or chapter's history from their inception to M41. It's as brief but as comprehensive as I feel it can be for the length of this video, and I of course plan to explore them further in as much detail then as I feel warranted along the line. The story of the Astartes is so foundational to 40k. It is one of loyalty etched at a genetic level into their bone, sinew and flesh. Sons born to serve, built in the image of their demigod-like fathers, the product of thousands of years of human technological advancement. The Astartes were sworn to carry the light of the Imperium across a galaxy shrouded in darkness. They accomplished this, but it is of course a tale that was then corrupted by unqualified, all-consuming tragedy. In the previous episodes we walked among the Loyalist chapters, the primary Legion chapters, who survived the heresy only to endure 10,000 years of war, and who still carry the torch of duty lit during the Great Crusade. But in the aftermath of the heresy, many were broken beyond repair. There were those who extinguished their oaths, cast down their banners, and committed abhorrent acts against the Imperium, their brothers, and humanity. Those who had once been the Emperor's finest became the architects of its greatest tragedy. In time, they would become known as the Traitor Legions, Astartes corrupted by all manner of base instincts, rage, their pride, resentment, despair, sometimes delusional ideologies, and the allure of raw warp power. For 10,000 years they have waged the long war from the Eye of Terror and beyond. They have become nightmares beyond most human comprehension, some so warped they can barely be recognized as ever having belonged to their own race. Others twisted further into demonic horrors, some left hollowed out by madness or overwhelmed by baser instincts. Still others are left clinging to the tattered remnants of their broken ideals, sheltered in a ruined cloak of denial and ambiguity. Each Chaos Legion exists as a mirror to their specific damnation of choice, the rage of Khorne, the decay of Nurgle, the deceit of Tzeentch, and the seduction of Slaanesh. Each of these a vast oversimplification to what they can be understood to represent, and that I have covered in previous videos about Chaos, but at a face value these are their immediate foundations. Then there are those who would not allow themselves to be consumed by a specific shade of chaos. Some of the traitors remained more idealistic and ambitious. They sought the power and unity they had glimpsed during the latter days of the heresy. The understanding that if correctly employed, one could harness the power of chaos undivided, where loyalty is measured in the ability to spread corruption, treachery, and strength through domination. For those who required specific communion or individual power, this was more difficult to achieve, and often necessitated acts or scenarios that were simply unspeakable. For to understand the Astartes in M41, one must also explore the traitors, for in their betrayal lies the truth of what the Imperium was and could have been, and now what it must endure. In them, we see not only failure, but reflection. The traitors who survived the heresy persist as a deeply uncomfortable mirror held up against the Emperor's grand design. They are the persistent anger of sons who were shaped for war yet denied understanding, broken by the contradictions of the Imperium they helped to build. Their damnation is not simply the cost of rebellion, it is the legacy of a dream turned inward on itself. To know them is to know what the Imperium fears most. Not alien invasion nor demonic corruption, but its own truth laid bare. The raw darkness that exists inside every human individual. Those who are able to control it, suppress it, and keep it at bay within the confines and the boundaries of ordinary civil society. Those, such as the traitors, removed all guardrails and allowed themselves to be consumed by darkness until they became little more than vessels for the nightmarish conjurings of the void. The greatest betrayal in Imperial history ended not with a resounding, thunderous conquest, but with a bout of single combat that broke time and space itself. A once-in-a-civilization event, but that ultimately resolved in the most mortal of endings, an ancient blade thrust deeply through a son's heart. Set among the ruined spires of the Imperial Palace, amid the ash, blood and broken millions who fought in a conflict that was beyond their understanding of reality, the Siege of Terror reached its apocalyptic climax. After 7 years of civil war and galactic slaughter, the traitor legions, led by Warmaster Horus, finally breached the Emperor's last stronghold. And as the palace burned, the loyalists were reduced to broken pockets of Astartes, militia, custodians and dying thousands of human faithful, sheltered by the first stirrings of the imperial religion. The most stalwart of his warriors held firm the inner sanctum of the throne room and the external areas such as the Lion's Gate port, yet not without a deep sense of dread and desperation for what seemed almost inevitable. Of course, tale as old as time, the final gambit saw the Emperor of Mankind, accompanied by Dawn and Sanguinius, teleport aboard Horus's flagship. There, on the now desecrated bridge, the Emperor discovered Sanguinius slain, torn apart brutally and callously by an ascendant Warmaster, now fully embraced by the power of chaos, all but invulnerable. What occurred next, even though described to us, remains objectively myth, shrouded in ecclesiastical ritual and half-truth. But one aspect remains ever apparent. The Emperor, in their final duel, killed Horus. Not with hate, but with a carefully weighed finality. It is said that in this final act, the Emperor obliterated Horus so entirely there was nothing left to save. Yet even now, this remains a point of contention. The great battle was over, but the long war had only just begun. The Emperor's ruined body was entombed upon the Golden Throne, where he would stay as a living corpse tethered to the machinery and sci-tech of unimaginable complexity, unable to return as he might have done so as a perpetual. Instead, he remained locked in place, forced to cycle through life and death as a symbolic remnant of what once had been the master of mankind. Once the guiding light of the Great Crusade, he became a silent god figure. While his Imperium survived in something resembling a functioning civilization, it could not be whole. Never again, and neither could he. The heresy was over. What followed was a reckoning. This period remains to be significantly documented, but everything points toward us getting further revelations soon, which is very exciting. This being the period known as the Scouring. This was a period of relentless vengeance and brutal justice, where the remaining loyalist legions turned their full attention and wrath against the scattering, retreating traitor forces. The heresy had cost the Imperium worlds, entire sectors, hundreds of billions of lives, and the mortal form of its godlike leader. The answer to this was the Scouring. Arriving at Terra too late to prevent the horror, consumed by grief and guilt, Robute Gilliman, Lionel Johnson joined Jagati Khan and others to enact a campaign which saw loyalist forces unleash unrestrained vengeance upon the heretics. They hunted traitor remnants across the entire galaxy like a force possessed. Whenever a traitor legionnaire was found, be that hiding on some demon-twisted battlefield, carrying out their own failed crusades still, or clinging to the defense of doomed fortresses, they were mercilessly executed. The corruption of the heresy was a major problem as well in the aftermath, and for a time it was even questioned if Terra itself could be adequately cleansed. Whole worlds were scoured to remove corruption and deny the traitors any foothold. Once magnificent bastions of Imperial glory were reduced to dust. Guilliman, ever pragmatic, recognised the need to dismantle now not just the traitor legions, but the very infrastructure of the Legiones Astartes through his new Codex, a doctrine designed to ensure no one commander could again wield the power that Horus had so abused. Not all of Guilliman's loyalist Primarch brothers, of course, agreed. Some would capitulate on paper at least, while others simply resolved it with dismissive lip service. Very obviously, though, the Codex did not apply in any form to the traitors, and it became clear that due to their size, even the unmitigated vengeance of multiple loyalist legions would not be able to erase them from existence. And while thousands of traitors were slain, the 8 legions escaped total destruction, retreating instead into the Eye of Terror. At this time, the Eye of Terror was the only significant warp rift found in real space. It had been a region which bridged the warp hell of demonic unreality with the material verse ever since the birth of Slaanesh. And here, in this churning storm of chaos, the traitor legions found sanctuary. Or perhaps damnation. For their flight was less a retreat in the traditional sense, for they entered into a place which would see their complete metamorphosis. The Eye of Terror offered them something the Materium never could: time, power, and most importantly, proximity to the power of chaos. Time within the galaxy has always been contentious and troublesome, but in the warp, it has little, if any, meaning. This would then lead to, over the coming 10,000 years, traitor Astartes experiencing the bizarre perspective which saw them experience from their own view maybe only years, decades, or centuries, but upon emerging from the warp, discover that the great enemy of the Imperium had seen thousands of years pass. They found themselves facing chapters of loyalists they had never known, and Xenos of unknown origin and strength. Within this maelstrom, the surviving traitor Primarchs also became something more, or I suppose, from an alternative perspective, something less. Mortarion, Fulgrim, Angron, and Magnus each would ascend to demonhood. Others, like Perturabo and Lorgar, continued their dark works in seclusion. Alfarius, or, for the sake of saying it, Omegon, vanished entirely. And in the void left by Horus, Abaddon the Despoiler, former first captain of the Sons of Horus, would reshape his broken legion into a force that could one day return with even greater fury and more irresistible plans to undermine and break the Imperium where his father had failed. Yet while not subject to the reorganization of the legions who adhered now to Guilliman's Codex for the most part, in the Eye of Terror the legions found themselves unexpectedly diminished. The unity of the Crusade and the Heresy had become steadily fractured among the traitors. Their shared vision of the Heresy was gone, and with no official hierarchy to dictate their order, personal rivalries, old and new, flared. Many of the traitors splintered into warbands, each serving different goals or different gods. Their identities were no longer cohesive. Some clung to the rituals of their past, barely distinguishable from their loyalist brothers. Elsewhere, whole companies surrendered to the raw demands of the Chaos powers. And while there were those who remembered the Imperial truth with bitterness and still lived in the shadow of the heresy, others remembered nothing at all at this time. Now their minds and forms were warped beyond recognition. They lived only to serve. All the while, in the material realm, the Imperium knew all too well that the heretics had not been destroyed, and so braced for a second apocalypse. Yet their expectation of this never fully presented itself. The Imperium had expected the traitor legions to return en masse, to unleash effectively a second war like the Heresy. The traitor Astartes, now so heavily fractured, were unable to mount such a combined campaign, and so instead, across the centuries and millennia that followed, these so-called Black Crusades would stab and pick away at the Imperium. Demonic incursions, cult uprisings, and planetary rebellions became an oppressive rhythm. This was now the Long War. Though the heresy had ended, the Imperium remained locked in this perpetual conflict with the fractured remnants of those who had escaped justice. Each conflict a fragment of a shattered dream, a reminder of the sin that could never be purged. For the Loyalists, the heresy became both history and scripture. For the traitors, it was imminently at the forefront of their minds, a stinging wound inflicted in living memory. They had unfinished business. The legions often adjusted their names to suit shifting events, and just as the Dusk Raiders had become the Death Guard, the Lunar Wolves became the Sons of Horus, and in the aftermath of the heresy would be known as the Black Legion. But others retained their title, the Emperor's Children, the World Eaters, the Thousand Sons. From the perspective of the Imperium, these once proud and distinct forces of the Emperor were listed now only as heretical blasphemies in the litanies of abomination. Only the Astartes Inquisition and certain Administratum Libraria retained knowledge of their true origins. For much of the Imperium, this faded to become effectively mythology. But no matter how the Imperium chose to frame things, the traitor legions endured, warped, shattered, but unextinguished, driven by hate, spite, an unwillingness to admit defeat, a desire to simply be. What had begun as a rebellion of sons that had promised the mere overthrowing of a tyrannical father, and that would have ultimately allowed them to forge their own futures, culminated in the sundering of reality and the implosion of everything they had ever hoped to be. The Imperium never recovered, but neither did the Astartes. All that remained was a galaxy that saw war without end and the echo of eternal heresy. Heresy was not born on battlefields. It was born in the ignorance, misplaced entitlement and confusion of the Crusades' directed intentions and priorities. Before the traitor legions took up banners of chaos, they served a singular vision, one they were ordered and indoctrinated to believe in and abide by above all else, the imperial truth. This was the doctrine of the Great Crusade, and within it there was no room for faith, mysticism, or the idolization of godlike beings. Mankind, the Emperor decreed, would no longer kneel to the unseen. Enlightenment would replace superstition, science would banish the arcane, reason would extinguish fear. Theoretically, anyway. In practice, it's harder to bluntly put an end to an entire civilization's culture of belief, or at least its slide back into belief after an era of unparalleled progress. Those scholars who walk the line between heresy and Puritan beliefs may seek to question such assertions, because it was quite evident that this truth was only a partial truth. The Emperor knew that beyond real space, in the warp dwelled powers both ancient and malignant, entities formed not by biology or any reasonable evolution, but by the sentient minds of mortal beings, dreams, imaginings, emotion, raw and unrestrained. He knew the warp was far more than a means of travel. He had seen it for himself. He knew it for the longest time, fought within it, shaped it, bargained with it. And yet, when he sent his sons into the stars, into a space that would inevitably encounter and interact with that very realm, he told them nothing. The legions were denied the knowledge they would most need to survive, although it must be pointed out that this itself remains a point of contention and debate. But I would argue the reality that exists of the heresy somewhat undermines any argument that counters this. The Primarchs, superhuman in mind, demigod-like in physical form, were forged to command empires. But they did not lead the crusade. They were scattered before being able to take such position. But even upon their rediscovery, they were still left blind to the reality that would ultimately seduce and destroy them. The warp was an unspoken secret, its gods nameless. Psychic power was to be even now treated at considerable arm's length, if not outright banned. At best it was seen as an evolutionary tool, not an imminent danger. Curiosity to this effect was punished, any emergent faith most certainly scorned. The price of all of this suppression and silence would be immeasurable, some would even say calculated. And there is some evidence which points to this calculation, that it was a plan which spiraled out of control too quickly and too violently. Very often this is told to us through the words of those closest to the Emperor, such as Malcador. And so the beings within the warp reacted more quickly, more aggressively than had been expected. For this was a realm where thought becomes substance, emotion coalesces. Its ethereal entities formed from the collective dreams and nightmares of sentient beings caused over millions of years 4 great powers to emerge, each one embodying a facet of mortal drive or excess, each one a corruption of values the Emperor's Imperium claimed to uphold. For as much as they could be considered gods of eternal form, they were also little more than the permanent reflections of mortal experience taken to its ultimate monstrous conclusion. So after the long, slow grind of conquest, when the legions found themselves broken, betrayed and forgotten, they were now weakened enough in spirit to be susceptible to suggestion. They did not turn to the Emperor, they found chaos. The blood god Khorne offered strength in rage and purity in slaughter. For those whose lives were forged in war and whose pride had been shattered, it promised a path free of doubt, where every kill was a prayer, every battlefield a shrine. To the sons of Angron, once bound by martial pride but who steadily slid into indiscriminate slaughter, it was less a fall and more a release into freedom. The changer of ways, Tzeentch, whispered the promise of a truth wrapped in the power of knowledge. To seek forbidden understanding, to control the fates of others, and rise through cunning rather than strength. These were its sacred tenets. And for the 1,000 sons punished for their sorcery, driven to the brink by ignorance and fear, they embraced this ever-shifting fire, not as a curse but as a revelation. Plus, it was basically what they'd been doing already, so it was a natural shift. Grandfather Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, offered comfort and release in the surrender to entropy. This was not death, but the embrace of grotesque resilience, defiance through joyous rot. Those who gave themselves to Nurgle allowed suffering and decay to wash over them, and in return he gave them strength. The bizarrity of those who embraced plague gained resistance and a comforting numbness to the horrors that consumed them, body and soul. Mortarian's sons walked into the embrace of Nurgle with paternal ease. They were reformed and twisted into the walking nightmares of mortal beings, but the Death Guard found themselves finally their own strange malformed version of peace. Slaanesh, born of excess and ruin, promised sensation without end, perfection, obsession, beauty, agony. It blurred the lines between experience, pleasure and torment until they ceased to matter and all became a new realm that exists outside human experience. The Emperor's children, once paragons of elegance and discipline, fell most completely. Their hunger for refinement and perfection became an addiction that was impossible to fulfill. Their desire for praise and recognition was twisted beyond reason, and what they became was truly terrifying, but through their own eyes, transcendent. Not all the traitors chose a single god. Some refused to restrict themselves to such binary divisions. Many, in the aftermath of the heresy, saw the powers not as rivals, but as aspects of a deeper truth. Chaos, the warp, the void as a whole, most especially after having seen it empower individuals throughout the heresy without them having needed to worship a specific god. These warriors and warbands dedicated themselves to what became known as Chaos Undivided, a theoretical unity spread through corruption and understanding that chaos exists as a pantheon rather than patronage. These traitors saw themselves not as zealots or disciples, but as strategists, commanders of chaos, separate to their brothers who embraced a singular god, but equally delusional in their ability to retain their own autonomy. The most infamous of these was, of course, the first captain of the sons of Horus, Abaddon, the despoiler, heir to Horus and architect of the Black Legion. Where others had submitted, Abaddon rebelled. He cast down the symbols of the old gods, burned away the trappings of servitude, and swore vengeance, not just to the Imperium, but on chaos itself, for having used, failed, and broken his father. Through Abaddon, the ideal of Chaos Undivided found its strongest expression, a warlord who would wield all the powers of the gods without bending the knee to any one of them. His long war was not a holy crusade, it was a campaign of calculated destruction and reclamation through annihilation. The difference between those who serve a single god and those who embrace Chaos Undivided is not just doctrinal, it is existential. For this choice would ultimately shape the legions in whatever form they took, over time their fragmented warbands, their cultures and combat doctrine. Khorne's followers rush to the slaughter, shunning sorcery and subtlety. Tzeentch's disciples manipulate, deceive and weave power through the puppetry and ignorance of mortals. Nurgle's warriors endure and spread corruption through their unbreakable will and pustulant torrents of filth. Slaaneshi warbands blur the line between performance and warfare, chasing perfection at any cost. The traitor legions, once unified by purpose, fractured into cults, cabals and dynasties. Some driven by worship, others by ambition. Some seek to conquer the Imperium, others to reshape the galaxy in their own imagining. Conflicts against each other occur with frequency and often more fiercely than with the Imperium itself. For despite the outlook of those who see the warp as being undivided, the gods are not allies, and so neither are their champions, unless in exceptional circumstances. Still, all of this can be laid at the feet of the Emperor's silence, for he believed that control could replace understanding. From the very outset, this was self-evident, that denial could hold back destiny. But the warp cannot be denied. It is only delayed, and when the inevitability of the powers came crashing down with promises of power, knowledge and self-determined autonomy, everything the Imperium refused to give. There were even questions over the role that they could play post-Crusade in the Imperium's vision, something that seemed evident given the Thunder Warriors' fate. The traitor legions did not fall because they were weak, they fell because they were kept ignorant. They saw themselves as being abandoned and admonished by the Emperor, betrayed by their ideals, left to face the infinite with no armor but their own loyalty. For those who would not accept the new reality, they had to be liquidated. But for those who accepted the veil now lifted, the warp was all they needed, and there would be no going back. Because chaos is not just singularly about power, it is a mirror and an inescapable truth, and for the legions, it showed them who they truly were. Of course, the war that broke the Imperium did not end with Horus's death. His fall was only the beginning of something more steadily fracturing and far more insidious. The collapse of order among those who had risen in rebellion. The traitors did not march into the Eye of Terror as armies. They staggered, crashing, limping, bleeding, already fraying at the edges into its safety. Their strength had been, until this time, unquestionably immense, their hatred unshakable. But with their cohesion gone, the unity under Horus's mantle could not survive the weight of betrayal, madness, an internecine destruction. The traitor legions did not disband nor collapse. It was something altogether more representative of a slow disintegration of order. Some legions managed to hold together for a time, but the heresy had already seeded their eventual fragmentation. That same rage, pride, ambition, and ideological fracturing that had driven them to rebel also made it impossible for them to remain whole. Old identities were distorted or discarded, but this was a strange time where some still flew the banners of their legion, others burned them. Of the few who cared to discuss what the heresy had meant to them now, even fewer could agree upon a coherent answer. In the warp, time is fluid and identity mutable. 10,000 years of isolation certainly did not forge solidarity, it encouraged mutation. Of the philosophical, the physical, the metaphysical, warbands broke off from one another endlessly, often violently. Allegiances shifted, feuds grew eternal. A minor insult in whatever could be attributed as M32 might become a planetary genocide in M40. Their new reality was chaos, and it was not a cause but a canvas which saw each render its own truth upon it. This new reality is what gave birth to the long, unpredictable persistence of chaos as a galactic threat to the Imperium and indeed really anyone. It meant that the traitors were unlikely to be eradicated in their totality because they drifted across the stars like cancer cells, infesting forgotten systems, appropriating resources, and twisted means by which to replenish their own ranks. Armadas hid in warp shadows, seeding cults and rebellions in worlds long thought secure. The Imperium might crush one uprising, only to find another festering light years away. A hive city thought purged of heretics today might become a demon world in the coming centuries. This unpredictable nature of traitor warbands became one of their greatest, perhaps unintentional, strategic weapons, because some numbered in the hundreds, others barely a dozen. Some operated as raiders, striking in voidcraft from forgotten campaigns. Others used embedded agents in the fabric of Imperial society, guiding planetary collapse from within over centuries, not dissimilarly to, say, the Genestealer cults. And this disunity also birthed a paradox. For while the traitor legions were now broken and decentralized, and it were true that they lacked the unity that had once made them near to unstoppable, but in their fragmentation they had become uncontainable, in the sense that there was no single fortress to storm, no collective territory to invade, no high command to assassinate, no terms under which they would as a singular body surrender. Their war was everywhere, all at once, and yet personal. It was meaningless and eternal, but also could be deeply ideological. The warp, as ever, responded to this and reshaped them. To see some warbands becoming little more than nightmare, mindless beasts of chaos, and others continuing to retain near all their individuality from the time of heresy to exist as heralds or prophets of chaos. Others were just living weapons. Over the millennia, the traitors grew to where they no longer simply served chaos, they fully embodied it. The line between demon and Astartes, warband and cult, between reality and belief, became increasingly thin, each in its own way, becoming, and I apologize for repeating the point, but a reflection of the warp, and therein its insatiable hunger. But while it's true that chaos thrives in disorder, its gods are not without their hierarchies. Occasionally a figure arises powerful enough to unify a fraction of these broken forces, a demon prince, a warlord. They might lead a personal crusade, rally disparate members of ancient allegiances to a common cause, but such unity is near always temporary. For the Imperium, the threat is never resolved. There is no collectively agreed upon strategy to eliminate chaos, for most often, when defeated, it simply scatters, and like embers from a near extinguished blaze carried by into adjacent dry fields, they begin to smoulder, catch, and a new fire erupts, waiting for the wind to carry and spread it as far as it can reach. The disintegration of order in the traitor legions made their power diffuse, but also omnipresent. They still lash out at the Imperium, but instead of a single lance strike, it's a rain of blades. And the gods do not care either way. They feed on the strife, the suffering, ambition, upon war without end. And the long war facing the Imperium is less of a campaign and more a slow spreading affliction, a steady poisoning of Imperial certainty. Wherever it is cut away, burned out, it simply spreads, because the war against the traitors is eternal. The Lunar Wolves were not merely a legion. They considered themselves, perhaps rightly, the model upon which all others were measured. Where they walked, worlds fell into compliance. Where they fought, the light and truth of the Imperium was inevitable. Under their Primarch, Horus Lupercal, they won glory not just for themselves, but for a dream, an Imperium without superstition, united in purpose and reason, forged in war but tempered by the vision of a unity in human civilization. Even before they bore Horus's name, the Lunar Wolves were the Emperor's blade writ large across the stars. While not first in designation, they made themselves first in triumph, in trust, and first to embody the fullest ambition of the Great Crusade. No legion took to compliance with such zeal, and no commander more adept at turning conquest into loyalty than Horus himself. He always knew exactly what was needed, and where other legions failed, leaving only ash and silence, the Lunar Wolves were more measured, often able to establish stability, even admiration, upon the most challenging of isolated human colonies. Entire sectors rallied to the Imperial banner, not because they were crushed, but because they believed they had been offered something greater. They became the symbol of Imperial dominance, the stormfront before every diplomatic envoy, and the steel in the Emperor's voice. Horus's strategic brilliance turned war into theatre, his sons into icons of victory. Deployed to the most vital campaigns, the hardest worlds to crack, and the most politically fragile theatres of war. When the Lunar Wolves arrived, it meant that the Emperor's will was not to be interpreted, it was to be obeyed. It's a certainty that they were not just brutal conquerors, they were the exemplars of the Great Crusade, the vanguard of humanity's destiny, because their loyalty was to the Emperor, but it was also to his most idealized vision of the future. With all of this success behind them, it was all but inevitable that Horus were to be named War Master, so much so that it was not seen as a coronation, none questioned it. Thus, the Lunar Wolves became the Sons of Horus, a legion reborn in their stalwart devotion. Their name, their colours, their identity were reshaped around the man who now bore the Emperor's mantle across the stars. To the outside galaxy, this seemed a bold affirmation, but within the Legion it ran deeper, because they did not simply follow Horus, they loved him, and love in the machinery of the Imperial Crusade was a dangerous thing, because now they held loyalty to the Emperor, but love and devotion to Horus. They collected in smaller groups, more ideological discussions, the first cracks of doubt, the first questions of purpose and of loyalty. When Horus fell, the betrayal was not just practical, it was emotional, spiritual, ontological. The War Master's corruption struck at the heart of his legion's identity, and more broadly at the heart of the Astartes themselves. The same charisma that had made him beloved became the weapon by which he enslaved others. Some, like Ezekar Abaddon, followed with clear purpose. The thought of any other path was absolutely unthinkable. Others followed because they simply could not imagine a galaxy in which Horus was wrong, or that they would have the courage and audacity to otherwise disobey. They unleashed, with cold resolve and merciless horror, the atrocities at Istvan, the metamorphosis at Moloch, and the apocalyptic slaughter fought over Beta Garmon as they proceeded toward their ultimate goal, so that finally, at Terra, they approached the world which would see them face the Emperor himself as they broke the sky with fire and righteous fury. And then came the end and the death. Upon Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the Emperor struck down the Warmaster with finality, as we spoke to earlier. He was burned from existence not in anger, but in a moment of mercy. A single blow that ended the heresy. But its impact shattered the sons of Horus. Their entire purpose and identity was gone. Their father, their vessel for the gods of the warp, was dead. So what remained? In the time that followed, the sons of Horus were not just pursued, they were hunted. Loyalist forces purged their strongholds, torched, scoured any trace of their legion's iconography. The traitors were leaderless and aimless, clinging to the bones of a fallen ideal. Their fortress world invaded and defiled by rival legions. As the time of scouring was not just fought against loyalists, but against one another over resources and material power, and so the Emperor's children defiled that fortress, and even their gene-father's corpse was not sacred. Horus stolen, defiled, used in a blasphemous attempt to bring him back. It was Abaddon who ended that sacrilege. The former first captain, once Horus's most loyal blade, now stood as his severest judge. He would destroy infamously what was a clone of Horus, shattering the shrine and declaring the truth that none dared to speak. Horus had failed, and no resurrection could redeem him. The age of gods and kings was over. From this truth, the Black Legion was born. This was how Abaddon would become the infamous figure seen in M41. By stripping away the colours of his legion, the cool sea green now gone, it was replaced by the blackness of the void. The Eye of Horus remained, but it was now a warning, not a mark of devotion. He refused calling himself Primarch, rightly, deciding only to take the title Warmaster of Chaos. His legion would serve no single god, but chaos in its totality, undivided. Because they would not beg for favour, it would take what it was owed. Across the centuries and millennia, Abaddon launched his Black Crusades, each more than a mere invasion of real space. These were campaigns of corruption, destabilization, and metaphysical warfare. The Imperium dismissed many of these as failures, and this was an arrogance and overconfidence they would come to rue. And likely Abaddon was well aware of this, because in truth these were acts not designed to achieve singular victories. They were preparations, each one harvesting resources, relics, strategic ground for greater purpose. Demon engines were unleashed, traitor worlds seeded with cults, strategic assets shattered, and their losses felt years or even centuries later. So that by the period that saw the 13th Black Crusade, the galaxy finally began to understand, all too late, the scope of Abaddon's design. The campaign was no simple raid. It was a grand assault upon Cadia, the linchpin of the Cadian Gate, whose ancient Noctilith pylons had served unknowingly to humanity as stabilizing anchors against the warp. Abaddon knew full well their purpose and unleashed the Black Legion in its full strength against Cadia with a fury and a momentum unseen in living memory. Dozens of warbands joined them. Demons spilled into real space in endless torrents. Ships, the planet killer, the Blackstone fortresses that Abaddon had acquired, and arcane weaponry obliterated orbital defences. On the Imperial side, legendary figures such as Saint Celestine fought alongside the Loyalists, and even then, the world fell. In a final act of rage to ensure his objectives completed, Abaddon hurled a Blackstone fortress into the planet's surface, shattering it and with it, Cadia. The Cadian Gate collapsed. The Great Rift opened, tearing the galaxy apart with warp storms and a chasm of raw void space that was unable to be crossed by Imperial vessels. What had begun as vengeance became a galactic catastrophe, leaving an entire section of Imperial territory isolated and blind to the Astronomicon. The Imperium stood, but it had staggered badly, and still the Black Legion did not rest. The retreating Imperials were pursued by them, forcing Archmagos Belisarius Cawl to flee with a strange, mysterious artifact of significance. Their fate seemed sealed, but Saint Celestine intervened, drawing the pursuing traitors into a trap laid by the Xenos Eldrad Ulthran. This would see Eldari forces from Ulthwé, Bieltan, and beyond strike against the forces of Chaos. Weakened from their conflict upon Cadia, they found themselves now encircled and outmatched. The Black Legion were driven back, and while the Eldar ushered the surviving Imperials into the webway, this was not necessarily as allies, but something closer to what they understood to be necessity. Later, during the Vigilus campaign, which saw the Black Legion once again orchestrate a mass invasion under the cover of cultic rebellion and Xenos interference, Vigilus was a fortress world guarding a vital warp corridor across the rift, known as the Nakmand Gauntlet, and this would become a battlefield choked with blood and prophecy. While Imperial defenders fought Genestealer cults and Orc hordes, the Black Legion struck surgically, collapsing bastions and corrupting its reliquaries. However, as is often the case, what they sought was not immediately obvious. Certainly they were not seeking territory, they sought to destroy its immense stockpile of Noctilith, Blackstone. Abaddon nearly succeeded in claiming the world totally, but even as the Imperials suffered immense losses, they retained the world. However, the damage to Vigilus was deep and enduring. The enemy was no longer at the gates, it was within. And so Abaddon turned his attentions to other worlds within the Nakmand Gauntlet. Because his goals are never simple battles or campaigns of conquest, he seeks the annihilation of reality's laws, a transformation of the material galaxy into something that could no longer resist the warp's tide. The Black Legion does not kneel to anyone or anything, even when wielding weapons of gods. He remains a warlord of vision, not worship. In the later events of the Arcs of Omen, we would see the final evolution of what began with the Sons of Horus, a legion that once defined itself by love, loyalty, and brotherhood, now fights not for those things, but far more existentially the right to exist on their own terms. They're not an army of zealots or perverted indulgers of base desires. They retain perhaps the most from before the fall, and stand as warlords, champions, and visionaries who understand the truth of the galaxy, that it can never be truly ruled, only broken and shaped to enable their vision of reality to stand for as long as it may. Some within the Black Legion favour brutal attrition, others allow themselves to carry demon weapons that whisper in forgotten tongues, others will march with the relics of the Long War, bolters, soul-forged dreadnoughts, or demon-infused dreadclaws. And while no two Black Legion forces are identical, all do serve under one banner. They're perhaps the most unified of the fragmented legions. There are those who will always cling to the old ways, wandering the eye as ghosts of a long-dead dream. Others have broken away entirely, erasing their history, choosing even to serve Khorne or Nurgle in isolated, strange, mixed warbands. But none would challenge Abaddon openly. Those who would know that their fate would be simply to be destroyed, for he has fought the greatest champions of Chaos and the Imperium and bested them. He has earned not just fear, but whatever approaches legitimacy among the traitors. The Imperium still whispers the name of Horus as a curse, but it fears the name Abaddon. Not because he is greater by strength of force, but because in the aftermath of Cadia, the Imperium finally sees Abaddon for what he is. Where Horus was a creature of pride and unreconcilable attachment, undone ultimately by emotion, Abaddon is will incarnate. Despite being forged in what could be seen as failure, his near death and desire for it all to end left him as a raw, apathetic form in the aftermath, one that would become steadily reshaped, sharpened by rage, finally freed from what he had once been. The Black Legion is, unlike others, no longer defined by its past. While the wound left by Horus has never fully healed, it bleeds still into the stars, and in so doing persists as a constant reminder that the Long War was never truly about vengeance, but about proving that the Imperium's greatest failure still walks among the ruins it once vowed to protect. The Black Legion does not seek redemption, nor do they mourn what was lost. They are the echo of a betrayal so vast it reshaped the galaxy, and in their advance they carry not just the shadow of Horus, but the undeniable truth that the Emperor's dream was broken long before the first shot of the heresy was ever fired. They were once the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons. To wear the violet and gold of the Emperor's children was to embody the ideal of the Legiones Astartes in both form and function. Their armour gleamed, their banners flawless, discipline without question. They did not simply fight, they made war into art. They were warriors, yes, but also philosophers, orators, artists and architects of so many disciplines. Their victories were absolute. No waste, no crude slaughter, no defacement of what could be uplifted. In the Great Crusade, they were the image the Imperium wanted the galaxy to see, a vision of humanity at its most refined, its most noble. Their Primarch, Fulgrim, was the living embodiment of that principle, a being of exquisite appearance and razor intellect. Fulgrim believed utterly in the Emperor's vision of a galactic unity. More than that, he sought to elevate it. He did not see conquest as mere compliance, but as enlightenment. Civilization, culture, and craft followed in his legion's wake. Fulgrim sculpted worlds as much as he subjugated them. He believed perfection could be imposed and that he, as the Emperor's son, had been chosen to deliver it. But perfection is a blade without a hilt, in the sense that the Emperor's children did not fall in a single moment of revelation, nor were they always the willing instruments of Slaanesh. They would be beguiled by a focus upon an objective that could never be complete: perfection. When the Great Crusade began, the god of excess had already awakened, born in the psychic scream of the Eldar's downfall and the creation of the Eye of Terror. Yet, Slaanesh's presence was still a whisper in the warp, a rising current rather than a tidal wave. The Third Legion's descent into excess and sensory obsession mirrored the growing pull of that power. By the time Fulgrim encountered the demonic blade that would begin his corruption in earnest, the path had already been laid, this time not by ignorance, but by pride. And when they finally embraced Slaanesh, it was not as servants kneeling in chains, but as artists and killers who believed they had found liberation in the undoing of all restraint. Fulgrim's soul trembled. His desire to elevate himself beyond the limits of flesh and form became the crack through which damnation poured. Fulgrim had recovered a Xenos weapon, curved, beautiful, alien. It whispered to him, not in words, but in suggestion, because the demon within the blade did not demand obedience, it offered resonance. Fulgrim did not notice the change at first, but soon his pride became hunger, his leadership became domination, and his artistry became obsession. And in time his soul was no longer his own. Through Fulgrim's influence, the Emperor's children also began to change. They trained harder, pushed further, demanded more and more perfection. Their senses were honed beyond human limits. Music became ritual, pain became focus, and decadence became theology. They began to experiment with sensation, sonic weaponry, psychotropic drugs, amplified emotions. What once had been elegant became unbearable in its intensity, and they did not fall all at once, but in stages, each compromise wrapped in silk, each crime rationalized as perfected refinement. Although none realized it at the time, this marked the beginning of the Primarch's fall, and through him the corruption of his legion. As Fulgrim succumbed to whispers beyond the veil, his sons began to experiment more, not just with tactics and weapons, but with sensation. And so, during the heresy, that transformation solidified. In the wars of the Istvan system, and later on Terra, the Emperor's children discovered that sound could kill, not through crude sonic waves, but through the weaponization of emotion, agony, and ecstasy. Demon-wrought innovations and warp-altered amplifiers turned once standard sonic weapons into instruments that unleashed a cacophony of madness. Bolters were fused with war horns, sensory modulators, psychoacoustic emitters. These unholy devices did not merely rupture bodies, they shredded the minds and overwhelmed the soul of their victims. They became the cacophony. These would be the first generation of sonic-wielding fanatics who fought not for victory but for the violent beauty of sensation. And where their battle cries once honoured the Emperor, now they screamed for Slaanesh. The warp howled in chorus, and in that rapture something new was born. They would be known as the Noise Marines, the warriors who waged war not to conquer but to perform. Every battle was a symphony, every weapon a shrieking hymn to excess. Their armour became gilded and grotesque, adorned with vox grills, sensory arrays and corrupted sigils. They no longer heard orders, only the discordant melodies of the battlefield. They were the Emperor's children, unbound, no longer seeking perfection in form, but in the experience of ruin. To many, they were the purest echo of Fulgrim's fall, the warriors for whom silence was blasphemy and death the final note. Because when the heresy broke into the open, the Emperor's children were no longer a legion of noble ideals. They were a choir of murderers. And while other legions battered the palace walls or made war in orbit of terror itself, the Emperor's children roamed the streets indulging in atrocity. They slaughtered civilians not for strategy, but for art and pleasure. They assaulted any and all, mutilated, defiled, recorded their excesses. They used their sonic devices for expression, for release, for performance. The heresy ended. Horus died. But the Emperor's children did not flee in shame like so many. They rejoiced. Terror had been their stage, and their performance had transcended war. In the warp, they found their new paradise. Fulgrim, fully possessed and willingly corrupted, ascended to become a demon prince of Slaanesh. He shed the last of his mortal restraint and vanished into the warp, re-emerging only when it suited his own grotesque appetites. The Legion itself splintered like so many into debauched warbands, each a travelling horror carnival dedicated to pursuing sensation without end. The Emperor's children have become the most notoriously unpredictable of the traitor legions because their warbands tend to be small, mobile, but devastating. Some will pursue this musical perfection with their noise weapons, emitting frequencies capable of liquefying enemy organs and corrupting their soul. Others blend pleasure and pain into ritualized combat, turning battle into theatre, victims into performers, and not entirely dissimilarly from the Drukhari in that regard. Their armour is often adorned with gilded carvings, exotic pigments, and self-inflicted wounds. Their voices all distorted with vox choruses. Their personal physical aesthetic so extreme that often humans who lay eyes upon them are confused into thinking that these are somehow Astartes, but that have suffered horrifying injuries. Some of their most notably feared warbands include the likes of the Flawless Host, known for their obsession with precision kill counts and sound-based executions, the Crimson Delight, which records its battles as audio rituals for replay within their ships, and the Choir of the Flesh, whose warriors are cybernetically altered to emit harmonic wails with every movement. These groups do not act with military strategy, but with aesthetic intention, which in many ways makes them even more troubling and dangerous. Because, despite their fractured numbers, the Emperor's children continue to wield immense power. Their warriors are terrifyingly fast, surgically precise, and utterly immune to fear, just as they were during the Crusade. They carry weapons that are now enhanced by Slanesh blessings, blasters, sirens, devices that do not simply kill but shatter the mind and body with vibrational resonating agony. Their presence on the battlefield is often accompanied by distorted hymns, maddening harmonies, voices stratified in impossible ways. The weak-willed are driven mad, the strongest simply die. In the era Indomitus, the Emperor's children were noted to become more active, not least because Fulgrim had returned. No longer the base-level demon prince, but something far more monstrous. In certain sectors, bio-sculpted effigies of him appeared, serpent-bodied, winged, bearing multiple arms and a face which flickered between angelic and grotesque. Some said he stalked the worlds of the Segmentum Obscurus, gathering new disciples. Others claimed he was searching for a weapon, a masterpiece, that will complete his transformation to the perfect form. Their methods disrupt defense, sow panic, and spread psychic pollution wherever they're found. All the while Abaddon wages war with purpose, the Emperor's children create chaos within chaos. They destabilize everything around them, simply by existing in the pursuit of whatever they choose. In many respects, of all the traitor legions, the Emperor's children may be the most horrifying to comprehend, not because of what they do, but because of how far they have fallen from what they were. Once a legion of beauty, culture, and noble purpose, now they are absolute, grotesque parodies of that legacy. Their pride has become narcissism, their pursuit of perfection an unachievable obsession, their art atrocity. Some among their number are entirely aware of how unattainable these goals may be in reality, much to their melancholic, reflective despair. They were once artisans of war, warriors who believed that beauty and perfection were not trivial luxuries, but doctrinal obligation. Fulgrim instilled in them a purpose beyond mere conquest, for them all to be the finest expressions of the Emperor's vision, to elevate battle into artisanal craft. But the pursuit of true perfection was a lie that stretched thinner the closer one ever reached for it. And in this trap they found themselves caught for all time. There was never peace among the World Eaters. Even before they broke their oaths and raised chain blades against the Emperor, there was damage at the core of their identity, a fundamental incompatibility between what they were made to be and what they became. Unlike the other legions, whose descent into chaos was often more gradual, ideological, or sorcerous, the World Eaters fell less from a betrayal of belief, but from a final shattering that was the collapse of all restraint. As all Astartes, they were built to kill. This was their primary role, murderers of the Emperor's enemies. But unlike so many others, when they stopped pretending to be more than that, there was nothing left to curtail them. Angron himself never had a choice. That is, the truth buried beneath the blood, the screaming, and the legend. He did not choose the butcher's nails. They were hammered into his skull when he was still a slave. He did not choose to abandon Nuceria. He was torn from the soil of his rebellion, denied the right to die alongside those he had sworn to protect. He did not choose to become a general of the Imperium. He was paraded as a symbol of strength by the same emperor who had denied him agency in every moment that mattered. All of which contributes to making Angron, for me, one of the most interesting and tragic of the Primarchs. Created as the 12th Legion, they were known first as the Warhounds, deployed during the early Crusade campaigns to pacify worlds too stubborn, too feral, or too defiant for diplomacy. They were feared even then, favoured for missions where annihilation was preferable to assimilation. Their tactics were as direct as their chain axes. There was little doubt about their functionality just from the look of such tools of war, and this reflected the Legion itself. They did not negotiate, they executed. Their loyalty was forged through aggression, and while unyielding, they were just as sharp and dangerous to those who sought to wield them. When they were reunited with their gene father Angron, everything changed. Unlike other Primarchs, Angron was not found leading a kingdom or a people. He was discovered as a gladiator, enslaved, mutilated, and forced to fight in the arena of Nuceria. Into his skull had been implanted a device believed to have been some sort of bastardized technology from the dark age of technology, a remnant from a more enlightened time repurposed for a more chaotic, brutal age. This device was titled the Butcher's Nails, a crude neural implant whose true purpose was long forgotten. It punished hesitation, rewarded aggression. It flooded the brain with agony unless it was fed constant violence. When the Emperor removed Angron by force from that world, teleporting him during the midst of a slave rebellion that Angron had sworn to die for, in being torn away, he felt he had abandoned those who had nothing and still had given him everything. Angron never forgave that theft, not of his cause, not of his dignity, so that by the time he led the 12th Legion, Angron was already broken. The pain of the nails was constant. They demanded violence, and in violence alone he could find silence. Yet Angron was not lost completely. He still held the ability to think and form coherent philosophical views of his own. The conflict between the Emperor and Angron was as clear as ever. For example, in Ghost of Nuceria, Angron states, "If you are so mighty, why not help us? Why not step down from your golden palace here, down into the mud where the real struggle is borne out? Instead, you rip me from my destiny, from the only chance I had to ever grasp serenity, to fall a free man beside those with whom I twisted the rope and cast off the shackles." The Emperor simply replying, "Because I am the Emperor, and my eyes are set upon this galaxy, all her stars and worlds, and not simply the wars or tyrants of any single one. So shall your eyes be set, as you take up the mantle you were brought into this life to bear, the mantle of Primarch, to command your legion and unite the stars beneath my banner," which very evidently did not come to pass. And despite all the complexity and confusion that is wrought throughout the entire heresy, Angron had many of the most straightforward and clear observations about the Emperor, stating in Betrayer that, "We fight to silence anyone that dares draw breath and whisper a different opinion from ours. We fight because the Emperor wants every world in his hands. All he knows is slavery, painted in the inoffensive cloak of compliance. The very notion of freedom is a horror to him. I am told to conquer peaceful worlds that wish only to be left alone. I'm told to destroy whole civilizations and call it liberation. I am told to demand millions of men and women from these new worlds to make them take up arms in the Emperor's hordes, and I'm told to call this a tithe or recruitment because we are too scared of the truth. We refuse to call it slavery. I'm told to bathe my legion in the blood of innocents and sinners alike, and I do it because it is all that's left for me in this life. I do these things and I enjoy them, not because we're moral or right or loving souls seeking to enlighten a dark universe, but because all I feel are the butcher's nails hammered into my brain. I serve because of this mutilation. Well, perhaps I might be a more moral man like you claim to be, a virtuous man. Perhaps I might ascend the steps of our father's palace and take the slaving bastard's head." So, fairly clear to see that something of a wedge existed between what the Emperor wanted and what Angron saw, because his command was of a mind slowly being devoured from the inside while the galaxy called him a hero. The World Eaters did not follow a crazed, bloodthirsting madman, they followed someone who had never been given a chance to be anything else. The removal of the nails proved to be an impossibility, even for the advanced technology and skills of, say, Arkan Land, the Imperial Biologists, and the Emperor. And so the 12th Legion was effectively redesigned to become a reflection of his rage. And this took, eventually, a much darker turn, because when Angron decided that he would have the Butcher's nails adapted for Astartes biology, within his legion he demanded their implantation. One by one, the warriors of the World Eaters accepted them. Many were hesitant or outright critical, but they were steadily broken down by the pressures of their brothers until they accepted. The implants were known to be extremely overwhelming. Angron was able to bear it being a Primarch, but ordinary Astartes, the agony was unbearable, unimaginable. It rewrote their minds, it carved out reason, memory, and restraint. Discipline eventually collapsed. Tactical doctrine gave way to the sheer roar of chain blades and the red haze of the Berserker fury. From that moment, the World Eaters were no warriors in the true sense. They had become biological engines of slaughter. Their transition to taking up the banner of the Blood God was all but inevitable. During the Heresy, they had carved a path of devastation across the stars, where other legions fought for ideals, Lorgar for his own truth, Fulgrim the pursuit of perfection and compliance, Horus for just raw power, domination, and the imperial truth. The World Eaters fought for something approaching catharsis. They were unleashed upon the Imperium as a multi-bladed instrument, lashing the walls of resistance with sheer brute fury. At Isfahan 5, they tore apart loyalists in a frenzy which stunned even their traitor allies. And as the war deepened, so did their addiction to bloodshed. Angron, by then fully possessed by the rage and warp, led them not really as a commander but more as a living weapon. He couldn't be reasoned with at this point, he barely could be directed. But their worship of Khorne, the blood god, did not begin with rituals or theology as seen among others like the Wordbearers. For them it began with the resonance of slaughter and war, because the warp echoes what it is fed, and the World Eaters fed it blood and flesh and sinew and the screams of the innocent, endlessly, gloriously. Khorne answered, not with riddles or promises or direction, but with the fury and empowerment of its embrace. The World Eaters did not kneel to this god. It did not require nor need such symbolic acts as did others. Khorne simply required more and more and more blood. When Horus died and the traitor legions were scattered into the Eye of Terror, the World Eaters did not mourn, pause, nor reflect. They simply continued on, raging against loyalists, civilian worlds, anyone, anything within reach, even against other traitors. The heresy had been a feast of gore, and they were still hungry. Within the Eye of Terror, they were not immune to the fragmentation that afflicted all the legions, and the World Eaters collapsed into warbands. Some might argue this happened long ago, but just was simply not visible, because during the heresy, little remnant of discipline could really be seen, and in its aftermath, little if any endured. So even those who had once held rank were now simply seen as being the strongest, and that translated into the right to lead, whatever that qualified as, or until somebody stronger took it. And I see you Orc fans grinning from ear to ear, let's calm down. Now, each warband became its own cult of sorts. Some roamed space, attacking any target large enough to draw them in. Others settled upon demon worlds, building arenas and temples to combat. Entire warbands would disappear into the void for centuries, returning only when the call to battle stirred them from whatever unspeakable rites had so far sustained them. They fought each other constantly, over nothing, over everything, slights, insults, territory, or just boredom. Because Khorne does not care from where the blood flows, only that it flows. Like all traitors, their original title of the collective splintered also. They were not just the World Eaters now. They bore other titles: the Chosen of Khorne, the Crimson Path, the Scions of the Red Angel. Elsewhere, some forgot they ever had a name, or failed to see the purpose of such things. But wherever they were to be found, the roar of the chain axe remained constant. The nails burned deeper, and the tally of skulls mounted higher. Even among chaos, they became something of pariahs. Other warbands viewed them with fear, but also contempt. They were a powerful tool, but too difficult to effectively utilize. They were unreliable, uncontrollable, too far gone to be trusted, too dangerous to ignore. The World Eaters, if they could be simply directed toward an enemy, might be used as shock troops in greater campaigns, unleashed as a vanguard to break enemy lines or shock them into stunned impotence, then just left to burn themselves out. But in the rare moments that saw multiple warbands of their number converge, they formed a tide of slaughter that few, if any, planetary defense force could hold. And during the era Indomitus, their great Primarch, Angron, returned. Except not a Primarch. This was now only a memory. Angron returned to them as a demon prince, just as Fulgrim. He was reborn and transcended in flesh and bronze and brass and steel and rage. His resurrection shook the balance of the long war. He was no longer anything that he had been before. Now he was a concentrated form of a god's fury made manifest. And alongside him came the Eightbound, possessed warriors who had chained warp entities within their own flesh, refusing the complete loss of self that Demon had demanded, but riding the edge of damnation in pursuit of unrelenting power. They were nothing less than absolute monstrosities. Angron's reawakening saw a loose sense of direction return to the World Eaters, of course Kharn having been involved here as well, and I apologise for not having mentioned Kharn much more. I know he's very important, but it's just too much story. I'll come to that at a later date. But this sense of direction was not a directed strategy, to be sure, not any kind of Legion-like structure. It was more of a radiated focus, a clarity of purpose, perhaps, which may or may not have been the gods working through him. The Indomitus Crusade of Guilliman meant that the Imperium was once again marching, claiming, standing tall, and to Angron and his sons that was a direct challenge. In response, they tore apart entire subsectors. They shattered Imperial strongholds with ritualized carnage. Wherever Angron appeared, skulls were gathered, literally by the thousands, piled into shrines, so large they became visible from orbit. The return of the Primarchs, the both loyalist and traitor, had begun to change the scale of the long war, and Angron's rage gave it a new voice, renewed in its vigour, ferocity, and terror. In M41, the World Eaters do not exist as a legion. There's something more approaching an idea, a shared rhythm of reactive rage and slaughter, a pulsing agony of the nails throbbing, beating inside their skulls, translated to a tangible form. The screaming, unending, unquenchable pain, the roaring, chain weaponry, the war cries of the Eightbound. Berserkers tearing guardsmen limb from limb in showers of viscera and gore, wanton extremes of physical violence, so close that mortal allies can taste the coppery tang of blood in the air all around them. Their armour is painted in blood, their battle helms often absent, their mouths open in permanent locked screams. To face a World Eater is not to simply fight, it is to face concentrated vessels of war, to stand against such mindless, raging maelstroms of hundreds of thousands of years of conflict poured into them from the warp itself. Yet beneath the carnage, something remains ever missing. The World Eaters were never philosophers, but at one time they had their brothers. Once long ago, they had purpose beyond all the screaming. Now None can recall or fill this void, for it has been erased and replaced by the nails, by the need to kill. The Legion itself did not die. It was perhaps appropriately dismembered, one limb at a time, until only the scraps of flesh torn by the axes and blades and chain weaponry remained hanging on by a thread. So now what roams the galaxy in red and brass is not a reflection of humanity nor even of rebellion. It's too extreme to be comparable, too distilled and concentrated into its purest form of Khorne's insatiable hunger. Just as seen with those of the Emperor's children, their ultimate goal is potentially unknowable just as much as it is unachievable. Now, one more heretical than myself, and likely under the scrutiny of the Inquisition, might still venture to argue that their fall was in fact not treachery, that it was merely the final failure of an empire who believed somehow that enforced blind obedience could replace necessary healing and more steady progress, that the raw strength and its consequent brutality could be beaten into something disciplined and admirable was a entirely and obvious lost cause right from the start. For by the time the heresy came upon them, the World Eaters were already consumed by rage and the relentless, unquenchable thirst for blood. They were lost to the void and its eternal darkness, abandoned by the Emperor from the very beginning. Before they were the Death Guard, they were known by another name, the Dusk Raiders. That title, earned during the earliest years of the Great Crusade, was not given lightly. The 14th Legion, forged from the gene seed of a Primarch yet unknown, had established a fearsome reputation in the Sol system and beyond. Their emblem was a downward blade, a symbol of precise methodical execution. Their war doctrine was attritional, disciplined, and unwavering. The Dusk Raiders preferred to strike at twilight, advancing under the veil of low light, never retreating, never relenting. They were not fast, nor were they ostentatious. They were a slow, grinding certainty, and they never failed. They negotiated where possible. Where such solutions were denied to them, the only answer was violence. The Dusk Raiders were, as was typical, drawn heavily from the old war-torn nations of Terra during unification. These sons of old Earth were shaped by brutal discipline and drilled to fight in the most hazardous of environments: toxic war zones, irradiated ruins, chem-choked atmospheres. These were not challenges to overcome, but their preferred hunting grounds. They were a legion forged in hardship, and they bore it like iron. This identity would change forever with the arrival of their gene father. When the Emperor found Mortarion on the death world of Barbarous, he did not find a scholar or philosopher. He found a weapon, half broken, wholly dangerous. Raised among necromantic overlords who ruled from toxic mountaintops and who preyed upon the weak below. Mortarion had been tortured by exposure to poisons from the moment of his creation. He had grown strong, not in spite of this agony, but because of it. The very air that killed most mortals was his breath. His hatred of weakness became his philosophy. His contempt for privilege became gospel. And when he was taken from Barbarous, like Angron against his will, he was denied his final act of defiance against the monstrous warlord who had raised him. Thus, his bitterness curdled into something that scarred him permanently. Mortarion was given command of the 14th Legion, and as did all Primarchs, he reshaped it in his image. The title of the Death Guard was his choosing, a tribute to those lowland people of Barbarous that he had once vowed to protect. Under his leadership, the Legion's core doctrine of endurance was intensified to a fanatical degree, but this shift was not universally welcomed. For within the Legion, a deep rift had begun to grow between the Terran-born veterans of the Dusk Raiders and the Barbarous-born recruits of the Death Guard. These were indoctrinated entirely by Mortarian's bleak philosophy, and the Terrans saw their strength in their traditions, honours, and command structures, which were now being stripped away. The existing leadership were demoted, replaced by Mortarian's hand-picked captains. The language of the Legion changed. Even the way they spoke of war became colder, more contemptuous. Tensions inevitably flared. Some felt Mortarian was disrespecting the foundations of the Legion. Some barbarians saw the Terrans as weak over ceremonial traditionalists, slaves even to imperial hypocrisy and over-sentimentality. Though outright conflicts were fairly avoided, aggressive debates and disquiet among the brothers was all too apparent, and Mortarian tolerated this discord for a time. Eventually, those who could not accept his rule were quietly reassigned, broken in training, or just disappeared into battlefields that none were expected to return from. The Death Guard emerged from this crucible as a legion steeped in bitterness. They distrusted the Emperor, whom Mortarian obeyed but never loved. They distrusted sorcery, which Mortarian also loathed, and they believed above all in endurance. Pain was not to be avoided, it was to be embraced. Victory, not beautiful, was blunt, heavy, honest. The last vestiges of the Dusk Raiders would be washed away at the onset of the heresy. The Loyalists were massacred at Isfahan III, while others, including the legendary Nathaniel Garrow, were able to defect and escape in a bid to warn Terra of what was coming. But now, only the Death Guard remained. Mortarian committed fully to Horus's rebellion, and he divided his forces, one fleet under his command, the other under his first, Callus Typhon. While Mortarian failed in a bid to sway the White Scars at Prospero and waged futile war against Jakati Khan, Typhon orchestrated a campaign of attrition and deception against the Dark Angels. Their paths eventually reconverged, but it was Typhon who had begun to see what his Primarch would not. That victory in the now long war demanded more than brute endurance. It demanded significant change. The kind of change which could only be granted by the beings and the gods of the warp. When Typhon reappeared, he was quietly disappointed that Mortarian still had resisted the pull of the warp. But the seeds of divergence were already sown, and so, whereas Mortarian clung to the hatred and denial, Typhon had begun to understand the truth. He was more open-minded in seeing that in the rot there was power, and in death a form of ascension could be achieved. Mortarian had sided with Horus, not out of ambition but resentment. He saw in the War Master a leader willing to, for the longest time, tolerate, even to acknowledge the Emperor's failings, his secrecy, manipulation, his refusal to trust his sons, yet still followed his command. But Mortarian did not fall to chaos willingly. He believed he could use their rebellion to destroy sorcery and corruption alike. He was wrong, and Typhon was right. The turning point for them came in the warp. As the Death Guard fleet made its slow advance towards Terra, First Captain Typhon enacted his final betrayal. He accused the navigators of divided loyalties and had them executed by his grave wardens, assuring Mortarian that his librarians could guide the fleet unaided. But this was a deception. Typhon had deliberately led the Death Guard into a trap within the warp. They were caught in a stagnant pocket of unreality where time withered and direction failed. The fleet had become becalmed, drifting helplessly in the Sea of Souls, unable to retranslate into material space, and thus they were exposed to the malign attentions of chaos. Here is where the Destroyer Plague would be unleashed upon them, in perhaps one of the most horrific transitions to becoming the pawns of chaos seen through the heresy. A virulent, warp-born contagion swept through the ships, turning legionnaires into rotting husks, racked with unending agony, swollen to bursting. Their enhanced biology offered no protection. Their flesh bubbled, lungs drowned, their bones cracked and reshaped from within. Even the Terminator-armoured elite vomited blood and black bile, crawling through the rusting decks in agony, liquid pouring from their armour, red, yellow, black pools of stinking corruption. Even as the Death Guard suffered, Typhon was rewarded. From the corpse of Ignatius Grulgor, he absorbed the plague in full and would be reborn as Typhus, herald of Nurgle. His body became a hive of filth, his armour a living engine of disease. He had fully embraced what Mortarion could not yet accept. Stricken and furious, Mortarion resisted, but Nurgle came to him personally, offering release from the torment in exchange for submission. Faced with an eternity of undeath, Mortarion bent the knee. In that moment, the Death Guard were remade fully. They emerged from the warp as the Plague Marines, bloated avatars of entropy. Their Primarch transformed into a demon prince, enslaved to the grandfather of decay. When finally they arrived at Terra, they were no longer the Emperor's instruments of wrath. They were warp contagion given form. Mortarion hurled his plague-ridden sons into the thickest fighting during the Siege of Terra, clashing directly with Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, and finally Jagati Khan. Yet Mortarion was not the only spectre from the past who rose during that siege. Deep beneath the palace, one Nathaniel Garrow, the former battle captain of the Death Guard, who had once defied Mortarion's betrayal aboard the Eisenstein, faced his fallen Primarch once again. And Garrow stood not as a warrior of the 14th Legion now, but as a knight-errant, a blade of Malcador the Sigillite, forged anew. Their clash was not only one of weapons, but of memory and conviction. Mortarion, swollen with demonic power, found no absolution in Garrow's defiance, only judgment. The man who had once followed him into war now stood as the last echo of what the Death Guard had been and could have been. Garrow's sacrifice was ultimate, but he resisted to the end, thrusting his broken blade deep into Mortarion's neck in an act of shocking defiance that cut Mortarion to his core. The unthinkable had become possible. He was a Primarch, imbued and transcended by the power of the warp, and here, still, he had been wounded by nothing more than an Astartes. Mortarion survived but ultimately met his match in a brutal duel which saw the great Khan banish the Demon Prince back into the warp, and when Mortarion fell, command of the Corrupted Legion passed not to a loyal heir, but to Typhus, the one who had doomed them, reshaped them, and now saw himself as standing above his Primarch. He would be the one to lead them in the long war as harbingers of rot and the inescapable march of decay. In the 10,000 years since, they have become a contagion without cure. Unlike the other traitor legions, the Death Guard did not fracture entirely. They retained something like order. Their warbands were often larger, their structure more durable, but their unity was in the shared blight of decay and rot. They did not seek favour, no thirst for revenge. They were simply undeniable, as was the spread of their blighted endurance, just as Mortarion had promised. And their battle doctrine, perhaps in comedic turn, remained unchanged since the days of the Dusk Raiders, a slow advance, layered fire, relentless pressure. But where their former legion had purpose to suppress and force compliance through the inevitable irresistibility of their march, their new resilience became something transcendent. What had been tactical endurance was now elevated to immortality. They marched on, an irresistible force, but not in the name of the Emperor and enlightened compliance. Now they marched in nothing more than the name of corruption. Loyalist bolt-arounds vanished into layers of fat, bloated, diseased flesh, blades stuck in sticky, black necrotic tissues. Psychic powers recoiled and were reflected away from the laughing presence of ambling, skittering plague demons. The Death Guard were not unkillable, of course, not truly immortal, but most often close enough that it made little difference. Their greatest strength was not in their weapons, but in their patience. In the wake of Cadia's fall, they launched the Plague Wars, striking into Ultramar with virulent precision, and Mortarion himself would face Guilliman. Their battle was not just between brothers, but more between ideologies, for where Guilliman offered renewal, Mortarion offered truth. The truth that everything dies, that every empire rots, and that hope is a lie. Though Guilliman pushed them back, notably with some outside assistance, extensive damage was still done. Whole sectors were transformed. Cities became seeping hives, oceans black viscous soup, forests were fungal thickets. Even in retreat, the Death Guard left behind infection that could never be completely purged from a world. And despite their apparent unity, even the Death Guard saw warbands emerge from their own whose perspectives negated allegiance entirely. One group, for example, simply known as the Purge, held as little loyalty to their own as much as to the Imperium. Their belief was entirely fanatical, unbending. They were of the view that all life is corruption, and thus must be destroyed. The only salvation lies in the sterility of death. And the Purge know that they are too few in number to achieve this goal on their own, hence they pray to the god of plagues for some unstoppable virus plague that will destroy every sentient being. Though the Purge see their purpose as pure, those who witness the pestilence and starvation they leave in their wake are under no illusions as to their true allegiance. For when they attack a world, famine, pestilence, and death will follow. They are infamous for their conduct of genocidal campaigns and the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons on civilian and military targets alike. Upon the imperial world of Vaxhalia, the planet's surface was riddled with disease and crippling famine. Over the course of a single solar month, the Purge engineered the destruction of no fewer than 14 billion citizens, laying claim to the plague-ridden world in the name of their cause. Their actions are often seen by the broader Death Guard, who follow the directions of Typhus or Mortarion, as being entirely erratic and destructive beyond all good reason. Where other Chaos forces might target infrastructure or strategically symbolic areas, the Purge would eradicate everything indiscriminately, entire sectors rendered lifeless by viral bombardment and corpse fires. Carefully stoked plagues that were progressing well on a world by other Death Guard warbands would then be obliterated at the microbial level by the Purge, even their own cultists butchered for surviving a little too long. And I mention this because I felt it was noteworthy to show how some of these warbands differ from the broader goals of what qualifies more as a collective legion, because as I say, the Death Guard are more unified than most. For example, other Death Guard warbands might find themselves under assault by the Purge for just having shown some tolerance in allowing their victims of plague to persist in suffering. It's a good example of how chaos is often spoken about in a broad term by the Imperium, campaigns of chaos, chaos assaults upon a world, and so on. But this is primarily due to the Imperium not really requiring any stratification or differentiation between what is just immediately apparent as enemies, whereas within those who follow the creed and doctrine of their chosen chaos god or pantheon, it's abundantly clear that chaos does not seek nor enable unity. If anything, it drives its followers into pockets of ideological friction. And even though they may wear similar legion colours, their interpretation of their purpose, their role and duty in their damnation will vary wildly. Because for many, the long war they find themselves fighting is less against the Imperium than it is against existence itself, and that means even among their own. The Death Guard are strange also, in that they sometimes still retain weird slivers of old Terran tradition, half-remembered battle oaths, near-forgotten litanies now twisted into corrupted parodies of their original verse. And while some venerate Mortarion with fanatical devotion, they see in his transformation the perfection of their ideals, others reject that entirely. They see him as a consistent failure, and their destiny can only be determined by their own will or the likes of Typhus. But however they choose to perceive it, the Death Guard now share the same undeniable core truth. They no longer seek victory. Such a concept has near to no meaning to them. They exist singularly to endure, just as Mortarion promised them, to outlast, and to prove that of all the things the Emperor had built, they will crumble and rot and be brought down into decay by the forces of entropy. They were made to be an unbreakable wall of resistance to survive anything, and now they can. They exist to now survive everything, even entropy itself. Now, the Thousand Sons have one of the more complex backgrounds. Actually, much more than that, it's really bloody complex when it comes to these traitors. And in truth, it's quite difficult in an overview to hit every beat of their story, just as much as I anticipate the same being true for the Alpha Legion. So please accept that I'm actively omitting a few details here that are not essential. The Thousand Sons are one of the most tragic stories when it comes to the traitors, for where Angron had little choice in his fate, their Primarch Magnus the Red had always believed that he himself was the master of his own destiny. He was a being so defined by vision, knowledge, and will that the idea of being pushed into a choice by the hands of others was a violation of the self. And yet, at every turn of his story, it was not Magnus who chose treachery, it was treachery that was forced upon him. And that truth, more than any betrayal, is what cuts the deepest. During the siege, Magnus reached the point where he could no longer be carried by events not of his own making. At last he drew a line, not because it was a path he would have chosen, but because it was the only one left that belonged to him. And I feel it's important to establish from the outset that in truth Magnus did not damn himself as did others by their own weakness. He was damned by those who failed him so completely, namely the Emperor. The Thousand Sons were scholars, mystics, seekers of hidden truths, very different to many of the other legions. For even as their brothers burned across the stars with steel and fire, the Thousand Sons approached the galaxy as a problem to be solved, a riddle to be understood, not conquered. They spoke in languages no others used. They read signs in the warp currents. They studied the soul, and even while their methods made them suspect, their loyalty was never in doubt. Still, the tragedy of the Thousand Sons does not begin with anything so clumsy or offensive as rebellion. It begins even with hope. Because of all the Primarchs, Magnus the Red stood apart, not merely in his stature or intellect, but his essence. He was not simply psychic, he was a warp-born mind given flesh, a creature of immense insight and sensitivity, designed with purpose, but never given the full truth of it. The Emperor, who feared the power of the warp more than anything, had created a son who could see it clearly, and then refused to adequately explain it to him. Or for that matter, even his ultimate intentions for Magnus. Nonetheless, their bond was unique among the Primarchs and the Emperor. Magnus called the Emperor father with a reverence and sincerity that few of his brothers would ever express, because he saw in him not just a warlord, but a kindred spirit, another master of mind and soul. The Emperor and Magnus crossed the stars of the galaxy together in their non-corporeal forms. The Emperor gave Magnus the great work to assist in the building of the Imperial Webway, to use his psychic mastery for the future of mankind. But he gave it without sufficient guidance, without warning, without contextual understanding. And Magnus was never told of the warp powers, their great game, the eternal war between the Chaos Gods, the lies of the warp, the demons that twisted thought into weapon. He was forbidden to delve too deeply into the Empyrean, but given no alternative to understand its nature, it seemed inevitable that he would do so. And while others were taught to fear it, he was taught to explore, and then punished for doing so. Upon the Thousand Sons' homeworld of Prospero, appropriately named after an ancient weaver of magic in the stories of ancient humanity, the Legion thrived under Magnus's vision. They became philosopher warriors and sorcerer scholars. They sought the betterment of humanity through knowledge, and believed that everything could be traced and unlocked through study. These were, after all, the principles as laid out by the Emperor and the Imperial Truth. Everything had a logical explanation, and if you dug deep enough, even what appeared to be magic could be explained. So when they encountered and began to study the warp, they considered it like any other scientific problem. It should be safe to use as much as you could understand it. But its secrets remained continually out of reach. Nonetheless, with no reason to think otherwise, they used it to refine their abilities and control a significant problem that had arisen among their Legion now: mutation. These mutations, unknown to the Thousand Sons, likely were, at least in part, a direct cause of their warp investigations, or at least something that exacerbated it, because they became now more frequent. And it looked ever more like a curse upon them, but such things were, of course, not real. They had to dig deeper, they needed to understand, to discover a cure. And all the while their warriors became more twisted, they broke apart, screamed themselves into oblivion, and yet still they pursued their studies. To do otherwise would be to deny their very purpose. They could not unlock the paradox with any reasoning. Warp power brought corruption, knowledge, and mutation. Eventually, all these efforts became difficult to hide, and that brought them under scrutiny. The Council of Nicaea was infamously convened by the Emperor to determine the fate of psychic use among the legions. Magnus, of course, stood in defense of sorcery. His speech was passionate, logical, devastating in its brilliance, but in the end it didn't matter. He was ruled against, and the use of psychic power in the Astartes was forbidden. Which seems like that might have been something you wanted to do or outline from the outset, but, what do I know? The censure of the Thousand Sons and their activities was not taken very objectively. In fact, they took it very personally. But unlike the word-bearers who had already ignored explicit rules in the Imperial Truth as laid out by the Emperor, Magnus felt that he and his sons had been rebuked for the very thing he had been made to do, which seemed both a bizarre contradiction and somewhat hypocritical. His pride, once noble, curdled and soured. But still, he remained loyal. So much so that when Horus slipped into darkness, Magnus saw this in a vision. He tried to warn his father numerous ways. He had to warn them all of the impending disaster. Ultimately, they would use a spell in travelling to Terra to try to warn him, and of course, that warning was infamously the death knell of everything the Emperor had built. Magnus, in desperation, had projected his mind through the warp, a psychic intrusion of unprecedented scale, which tore open a path into the Emperor's sanctum on Terra, and in doing so, he shattered carefully placed psychic wards that had protected the Imperial Webway project that the Emperor had required to safely construct it. Now, without these safeguards in place, it allowed demonic forces to pour in from the warp. The great work was doomed. Terra was on the brink of collapse, and now the Emperor and his custodies found themselves effectively fighting against an unstoppable tsunami of nightmare horrors from the warp. And for anybody new to 40k, this is of course the origin of the infamous saying, Magnus did nothing wrong, because the humour being obviously that he had done everything wrong, but also nothing wrong, given that the Emperor had not shared with him enough information for him to have been aware of what he was about to destroy. In response, the Emperor sent Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves and the Space Wolves, to bring Magnus to account at Prospero. But Horus, already now fallen, manipulated that order and turned it into an execution. The subsequent burning of Prospero was total. The wolves descended with fury. The Thousand Sons resisted, but their world burned, and entire libraries turned to ash. Magnus, seeing his legions slaughtered, was lost. He surrendered himself to despair and was all but destroyed by Leman Russ. Except it was in that moment of anguish that the Changer of the Ways answered. The Chaos God of Change and Knowledge offered Magnus a path, power enough to save his sons and himself in that time, vengeance for what had been done. Magnus, consumed by grief, accepted, and in that moment he transcended. The Thousand Sons, once seekers of truth, became the servants of fate, their souls bound to a higher power, their forms warped, but the worst was still to come. Now, when I said that the Thousand Sons were more complex, it's primarily due to the events at this juncture. Although somewhat straightforward, there are many questions to the specifics here, and what occurred is also unfortunately very fragmented, which is typical for the lore, but more so in this instance. And what we're talking about is the Shards of Magnus, which I find to be one of the most poorly understood aspects of lore when it comes to Chaos and the Heresy. But with total fair reason, because it's genuinely quite confusing and, as I say, very fragmented. It's spoken about often vaguely. Nonetheless, this is my best attempt. Magnus's fall did not begin on Prospero, nor in the warp, but in the moment that he reached across the great ocean of the void to warn the Emperor. The psychic scream that tore through the Emperor's wards shattered not only the walls of the Imperial Webway project, but Magnus himself. Something like a psychic whiplash, if you will. And from that act onward, a part of his essence had already been lost. Magnus was basically broken, so that by the time he was cast down by Leman Russ in the burning of Prospero, the blow hit him harder than it would have just in its raw physicality. Magnus was diminished and broken in his soul, but not dead. His soul shattered like glass hurled into a storm. The Crimson King had become Legion. Thousands of shards, each a fragment of memory, emotional power, had been spun outward into the warp. Most were drawn back into orbit around his eventual reconstituted form, but not all of them. 5 shards, distinct and vital, had escaped him entirely. And this is where one of the very key figures for the Thousand Sons now and into their future emerged. This was Chief Librarian Ahriman, who, witnessing this fracture, understood what even Magnus could not, that the soul of their father had become this mosaic of dissonant truths, that he was basically lost. Among these lost shards was one which held his humility, his love for humanity, the better angels of his nature. It was sensed it lingered on Terra, but was unable or unwilling to return to him. Much later, deep in the labyrinthine vaults of the Sigillite, it would ultimately be bound into a fading Thousand Sons Psyker, Arvida, and from him seed Janus and the future of the Grey Knights. And again, as I say, this is all kind of vague, which is a little bit difficult, but to really drill down, you kind of have to just read the actual material. But these events are one of the most critical keystones to Magnus. Really what you need to understand is just that these shards of him broke away and then are kind of out there. The details of this are across numerous different stories like The Thousand Sons, Magnus the Red, novellas like Fury of Magnus, but they also take place in a short story, which often I find people again missing. The Last Son of Prospero. Highly recommend. This is also though why I always recommend to people to read those shorts, not just the key books from the Heresy, because they often tend to contain, yes, less material, but they contain critical information and context, which can be very easily missed. Anyway, so Magnus knew what he had lost, so did Ahriman, and they began the work of reunification. He sent his sons into the warp to track down the shards. Some were found in dead libraries, screaming vaults. Each fragment recovered brought Magnus closer to coherence, but never wholeness. And this mission is what ultimately brought them to the Siege of Terra, because Magnus declared it quite plainly. He did not fight for Horus, nor for the ruinous powers, but to reclaim the first and greatest shard of himself, that he believed was buried beneath the throne. His goal was personal and metaphysical. For him it was not just about conquest, but restoration. But this greatest shard had already been taken. It was extracted by Malkador and bound into Titan, where it would eventually form the psychic bedrock of the Grey Knights. So Magnus was chasing a ghost, and in that, the Crimson King's tragedy is made whole. Magnus's actions did not just fracture his soul, he lost himself, so that even reunited with many of his shards, Magnus remained incomplete. His war was no longer against the Imperium now, nor even against his traitor brothers, but against this emptiness within him, a psychic emperor of dust and fragments reaching backward, but ever too late. And that's really basically the Shard's story. It's a confusing concept to begin with, it doesn't really have a resolution, but we also later learned that the Emperor had this sort of similar power to shard elements or remove pieces of himself to make him stronger against Horus. But whereas Magnus had kind of lost these things, the Emperor saw them as necessary to cut out and remove so that Horus couldn't use his empathy against him, basically. So it's seemingly this ability of extremely powerful psykers, and for the Emperor this was a necessity to emerge victorious, but I think it also connects to some of the deeper mythology we understand when it comes to, say, the Eldar, and even the Old Ones. And without going on too strong of a tangent here, there is language which suggests some actions were possible in beings of very powerful psychic ability, and however you would choose to interpret it, say their soul, it's why I have often said that Eldar souls seem to be different to humans, because they're more persistent, and seemingly some may have this same ability to shard themselves into different places for different functions. Anyway, this is a whole side topic with 40k in general as to the power and ability and range of psykers who can seemingly transcend entirely the mortal plane, which of course makes sense. But now if we can skip back to the aftermath of the burning of Prospero, Magnus had transferred power to Ahriman, whom he had foreseen would survive this day of scouring by the Space Wolves. Magnus was far less sure about whether he himself would survive. And over time, as we noted, the Legion had begun to decay, not just in flesh but in their mind and identity. The mutations and their psychic instability had intensified. So now Ahriman found himself imbued with this immense psychic power. He was once Magnus's chief librarian, and he chose to enact the spell of the Rubric, and this was designed to preserve the minds and the forms of the Legion. It succeeded spectacularly, and failed spectacularly, because those strong in psychic power were stabilized, those without were consumed by the void, reduced to dust-bound husks. Their souls were sealed shut in their power armor for eternity. They could no longer think, speak, or feel. They became automata, sentinels, the Rubricae. Magnus, caught off guard once again, was enraged by Ahriman's presumption and banished him. The Legion shattered further. Warbands formed, each interpreting their fate in different ways. Some embraced the will of Tzeentch fully, others sought to reclaim their lost brothers. Still more turned to arcane pursuits far beyond the concerns of war. The Thousand Suns' transition to chaos was complete. The last thing to note is that during the climactic stages of the siege, in a moment glimpsed only through the warp haze, and I would argue if we go by my general interpretation of the lore, this is a scenario difficult to substantiate. It's the Emperor speaking directly to Magnus. He offered his son forgiveness and offered to cleanse the scars of chaos from Magnus's soul. He would rebuild a new legion from Magnus. And there exists speculation that this would in fact have become the Grey Knights, especially when we point toward the events that took place prior, but regardless, the cost of redemption laid out before Magnus, that being the sacrifice of his own existing legion, or as he saw it, whatever remained of his soul, he chose his sons. It was arguably not the wisest choice objectively, but I think for Magnus it was simply the only choice he could make and still live with himself, to retain whatever control he had over his own sense of self, his own identity. Magnus refused the Emperor for the last time. Some say it was pride, that the betrayal of Prospero could not be forgiven, others that Magnus had already seen the configurations of fate and that none led backward for him. It's possible that Tzeentch did not allow him to see or to answer freely. Perhaps it was all of these, or none. Or maybe he quite simply just did not believe the Emperor's offer was real. But in that moment, the tragedy of the Thousand Suns became irreversible. In M41, the era Indomitus, the Thousand Suns remain fractured but potent. Ahriman, still exiled, continues his quest to perfect the rubric, to undo the mistake, or perhaps to somehow complete it. Magnus commands from the planet of sorcerers, unleashing warbands to unmake reality itself. The Thousand Suns have re-emerged with terrifying strength. No longer content with manipulation, they stride into war as gods and avatars of fate. Demon engines scream with eldritch fire, rubricae march in unbreakable lines, sorcerers call down temporal storms and reality-rending bolts as they ride discs of Tzeentch into battle. For the Thousand Suns, each conflict becomes a theatre of transformation, not just the slaughter of their enemies, but the meaning of reality itself. Beneath the power, the dust still whispers. They were not made for war, they were made for understanding. The Thousand Suns do not forget their numerous betrayers. The rubricae stand as permanent, silent sentinels to everything that has been lost, for in trying to understand everything, they brought about their irreversible destruction. So in this episode, we've explored the blood-slick path that brought the traitors from a time of brotherhood to one of damnation. I think what has always remained most captivating about the former sons of the Emperor isn't just that they fell, but obviously how they fell. Each was so different and held great implications for both past, present and future, and while some collapsed into just madness, others were entirely broken by grief, the rest imbued and invigorated by the lust for vengeance. There were those who chose their path with eyes wide open, revenge, pride, some desperate desire to be free of what they were made to be, to no longer be enslaved by the demands of the Emperor, to make their own choices, no matter the cost, to embrace everything that they thought they could be. And surely that's what makes chaos fascinating. It's this collapse, the cascade, the fall into utter darkness and unrestrained exploration of the self, every individual's attempt to reach whatever they think their full potential could be. Chaos never offers easy answers, only the promise of unrestrained, limitless power. And yes, often that comes at a horrific cost, one that's rarely clear or even favourable. Because whilst chaos corrupts, it is very clearly much more than that. It is eternally fluid, adaptable, arguably unstoppable. The inescapable horror for the traitors is that the longer a legion endures under the shadow of the Chaos Gods, the allure of their power and the ability to indulge in whatever whims or campaigns that they see fit leads them to becoming ever more fragmented, unstable, and monstrous. Their warbands will rise and fall, their champions ascend only to then be cast down. And as has been described so recently in newer material about Chaos Astartes, favour and glory is ever fleeting, but damnation remains eternal. This instalment for the series is of course only half the story. In the next part we'll dive into the other equally intriguing traitors, the word bearers who remain particularly interesting for their religious fervour, but who remain quite often misunderstood. The Iron Warriors consumed by what can only be best described as their siege-born spite. The Loyalist-era savagery of the Night Lords was bad enough, but now traitors, it singles them out as one of the most feared, abhorrent enemies known to the Imperium. And then of course, the shadowy, enigmatic Alpha Legion, which I feel reluctant to even begin to discuss, such as the wild, unending labyrinth of speculation and guesswork that surrounds them. So a great thank you for watching today. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see discussed most surrounding the traitor legions beyond this, any specific characters you want me to dissect, and of course I greatly appreciate all support here as always. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like, as it all helps to support the channel, guides me what to cover next. You'll find all the further links, including Patreon and socials, below the video. And I'll finish with the final thought about the Astartes, that these were not born traitors. They were made so by silence, ambition, and mostly by the Imperium's own hand. In every shattered legion, in every broken Primarch, lies a reflection of what the Emperor built and what he abandoned. Though they continue to burn eternal with their hatred, what drives them onward is never about conquest. It's not even about vengeance. It's a twisted echo of what they were once meant to be, the founders of a new era of galactic unity, one which was so tragically consumed by flame.